I wonder if anyone's heard the phrase, love is a choice. Anyone heard that phrase? Yeah, a few nods. For those of you who know me, I'm getting married soon. Whoop, come on. In the next 4 months, I'm getting married. And something that's been repeated often in our marriage prep is love is a choice. Love is a choice. Sometimes I walk into my friend's kitchen and they'll be midway through a row and this person, one of them would walk past me, storm past me, love is a choice, Jacob, love is a choice, love is a choice. Reminding me that love is a choice when you don't feel like loving the other person. And I've learned this as I play sport with our youth worker, Johnny, is that when I don't feel like loving him on the golf course, when I don't feel like loving him on the squash court, I have to realize that love is a choice. This is something that Ellie at the minute is having to learn. I don't know if you can hear me. I've got a cold. No sympathy from any of you. That as I'm looking for sympathy from Ellie, the thing that she's realizing is that love is a choice. But love is a choice. And how is it then that you love the unlovable in the other person? How is it then that you love the unlovable in a group of people? And I know that sounds quite severe when it comes to me talking about a cold or when it comes to talking about a squash game. But what happens when Jesus encourages to love the unlovable? What happens when Jesus calls us? What happens when Jesus invites us to love the unlovable in a group of people? Here at St. Wilfrid's at the minute, we are midway through a sermon series where Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins to unpack what it means to live the Jesus way. What does it look like to live in his way? What does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? And he begins to flip a load of cultural narratives on its head. Jesus begins, as we've looked at over the last few weeks, Jesus has taught us that if you are at the end of your rope, Jesus is there. Jesus has taught us that when we're hungry, he feeds us. We looked at last week how we're to be salt and light, how we're to stand out in the world. And this week, Jesus is giving us a new way of living through loving our enemies. And I'm so aware that this falls on Remembrance Sunday. And that for many of us, when it comes to looking at loving our enemies, this isn't just loving the difficult person that we work with, though for some of us that is true. This is a deep, deep act for us to do. And it requires a lot of pain for some of us. That some of us, loving our enemies can be quite hurtful. Loving our enemies can be quite a deep, wounded act for us. And there's various different degrees for every single one of us in the room. Not every one of us, not all of our pain is going to look different. Not all of our enemies are going to look different. For some of us, our enemies, they go a lot deeper than we want to share. And for some of us, our enemies, they'll be something that we can almost laugh about. Like loving the person on the squash court. But the thing that Jesus calls us to do, the thing that Jesus is pointing at in this section on the Sermon on the Mount is to love our enemies. And I find that a real challenge. I thought about a story as I was preparing this. I thought about a story that I could share when, usually when you're preparing a sermon, you've got an opening story. And I couldn't find a story that paints me in a good light. Because when it comes to loving enemies, I find that quite difficult. There's certain people, I don't find people easy to love, but there's certain people where there's moments where I find it really challenging. And I don't get it right all the time. I don't get it right to love my enemy all the time. And if we're honest, if we all start sharing stories about how we find it difficult to love our enemies, we'd all look at each other differently. But loving our enemies can be quite a challenge. Loving our enemies is a challenge for most of us, particularly when it comes to Remembrance Sunday. And I believe that this is a word in season, not just as we remember on the lives that are lost, but we reflect on the lives that are being lost in Ukraine as well. What does it look like to love our enemies? To love the inexcusable, to love the unlovable. This is what Jesus is bringing to us as a church this morning. This is what Jesus is bringing to the Jewish people on the Sermon on the Mount. See, the Jewish people at the time of Jesus saying this, they had every right to hate their enemies. They had every right to hate their enemies. They were persecuted. Their enemies caused terror. Their enemies caused wickedness. Their enemies caused pain to the Jewish people. And they have every right to hate them for what they've done. It was their right to hate their enemies. Of course they were going to hate their enemies. And no one would have blamed them. For what their enemies would have done to them, they would have had every reason for them to hate them. And what Jesus is saying here is he's saying, I want you to look at your enemies and I want you to love them. The last thing that they were wanting to hear, the last thing that they were expecting to hear is the call to love those who persecute you. To love those who have damaged you, to love those that have caused you hurt, to love those that have caused you pain. This is what Jesus is bringing to these people. And I look at that and I think, crumbs, really? Is that really what I've got to do? To choose to love the person that's hurt me, to choose to love the person that's caused pain in that part of my life or in that person's life. The call that Jesus is bringing us today is to love our enemies. I find this story I'm about to share quite striking. There was a lady in 1972, there was a lady called Corrie ten Boom. And Corrie ten Boom was a prisoner of war in the Second World War. She was a Dutch lady who helped Jewish people escape and run from the Nazis. And Corrie ten Boom was taken into a concentration camp. And she was there for 12 years. And she was there and she went into the concentration camp with her sister. And she went into the concentration camp with her dad. And in the concentration camp, she would tell people about Jesus. She would share the message of Jesus. She'd share the message of hope to people in the concentration camp. And 12 years later, she was released. But she was released on her own because her dad and her sister had died in the concentration camp. And then several years later, 2 years later, Corrie ten Boom returned to Germany. She moved back to the Netherlands and then she returned to Germany and she was preaching in a church in the land where she was held captive for so long. She was preaching in a church and she was preaching on the message of love and forgiveness. And as she preached this message of love and forgiveness in Germany, 2 years after the war had finished, the room stood still. And then from across the room, she recognized the man and began to walk up to her. And as she looked at the man, shivers went down her back. It was one of the prison officers that held her captive. And she saw this man do some terrible, terrible things to people. She remembered his face. And this man walked up to her at the end. And the man says to her, "Isn't it wonderful, Fraulein, that Jesus can forgive a multitude of sins? Isn't it wonderful, Fraulein?" And he reached out his hand to shake it, for Corrie ten Boom to shake it. And she writes in a book that anger filled her body. Anger filled her body, rage filled her body, because she recognized this man doing some inexcusable things to people that she loved, inexcusable things to people that she lived with, inexcusable things to family. And here she is in a church after preaching a message on forgiveness. This man stretches out his hand saying, "Isn't it wonderful that Jesus' blood covers a multitude of sins?" And she felt like the Lord say, "Take it. Take his hand." So she reached out her hand and shook the guard's hand. And what she writes in the book, she says she felt like the Holy Spirit fill her with love and compassion for this man and felt forgiveness flood through her body. What does it mean to love the inexcusable? What does it mean to love the person that's caused us so much pain? Why do I tell you that story? Because she chose to move towards that man in love. Corrie ten Boom chose to move towards her enemy, the person that's caused the most pain, the person that's caused the most hurt, the person that's played a part in ruining her life, what could have ruined her life. And she chose to move towards him in love. This is what it looks like to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This is what it looked like for Corrie ten Boom when she was a prisoner of war preaching this message to a man who held her captive. What does it look like for us this morning to love our enemies? See, I see this passage, and one commentator, as I was reading this, says that when we come to this passage, we're to approach it as if it was Jesus telling us what he's done for us. Let me say that again. We're to approach this passage as Jesus is instructing us to love our enemies because we approach it in the lens that this is what Jesus has done for us. Let me read you this. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Jesus loved his enemies, and Jesus loved us. So often we can so easily detach our sin from what was put on the cross. But as Jesus was nailed to the cross, as Jesus took persecution, as he took a beating that he did for us, as he was whipped within an inch of his life, as he was beaten, as he was mocked, as he was spat on, Jesus was doing it for us. And he prayed the prayer, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What we see on the cross is we see a Jesus who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, endured the beating, endured the shame, endured the mocking, and from his enemies because he chose to love them. And on the cross, he decided to pray for his enemies, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is what Jesus has done for us. 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. The only way that we can love our enemies this morning, the only way we can pray for those who persecute us, is because Jesus did exactly that for me and for you. And for some of us here, we're approaching this passage in so many different ways. We come at this passage from so many different lenses. We come at this passage from so many different angles. And for some of us, it's your first time in church for a long time. For some of us, we've been in church for a long time and we're realizing, actually, this is what Jesus has done for me. And for some of us, we might even be enemies. We might have done stuff to other people. We might have done the inexcusable to other people. We might have done things, we might have said things that has caused pain, that's caused hurt to another person or group of people. But the answer for all of this, the answer for this pain, the answer for all of this is love, and love from Jesus. We love because he first loved us. We're to love our enemies. We're to love the inexcusable because Jesus loved the inexcusable in us.